Welcome to China Tech Talk, the weekly discussion of technology and startups here in China. I am John Artman, editor-in-chief of Technode.com, joined as always by Matthew Brennan, founder of China Channel. So this week we have Fritz Demopoulos on the show to talk about his journey with Qunar.com. As you probably know, Qunar is one of the number one destinations for travel, both in terms of getting information, but also booking all sorts of different travel, including plane tickets, train tickets, hotel, and services around that. Currently, it's owned by Ctrip, but we get a bit of the backstory on how it was actually founded originally by some expat co-founders, including Fritz, of course. And then we also take a look at what are some opportunities for entrepreneurs in China currently. Fritz is now the founding partner at Queen's Road Capital in Hong Kong. No longer an entrepreneur, he focuses more on helping young teams get their products off the ground. And with that, we give you Fritz Demopoulos. All right, well, Fritz, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today.
Hey, John, I'm happy to be here with you and Matt.
So one of the first questions that we like to ask all of our guests is what's your China story? And, tell us everything leading up to you being in Beijing in 2005.
Yeah, okay. I moved to China in 1997, and what initially brought me to China was I was an expat like a lot of people. I was working for a media conglomerate called the News Corporation. That's part of the Murdoch Empire, and I had this unique opportunity to come to Beijing. I remember back then I had some great opportunities to work in other parts of the world, and oddly enough, Beijing paid the least amount of money. It had the least benefits, but it sounded like it would be kind of an amazing adventure. So that was in 97. Fast forward a couple of years, by 1999, the internet bubble was in full swing. Some of my friends were starting companies, and I was like, well, that's crazy. That's what I need to do. So in 1999, me and my co-founders, we set up a sports company called Shawei, which means brave shark in Mandarin Chinese. We were fortunate to get SoftBank to be a lead investor along with Intel and IDG. We grew that business, became one of the top sports properties in the country and clearly the largest online player, and was profitably acquired by a unit of Hutchison Whampoa Limited, which is a Hong Kong conglomerate. So that was like my first, say, foray into the Chinese tech space. And after that, I was a bit bored after that exit, and I got a call from my friend from SoftBank who said, we invested with News Corp in this game company called NetEase. So what do you think? You want to join those guys? I was like, well, not really, but I'll take a look. So I went to their office in the Beijing Carey Center, and it was kind of interesting. I remember one of my first bosses in the United States once told me, you need to walk the halls of a company to really understand what's going on. So I was just walking the halls of NetEase, and the company had this amazing vibe. There was a lot of energy. Paper was everywhere. Every conference room was filled up. People are on the whiteboard, diagrams. And I thought, wow, this company is just on fire. And so I was fortunate to join them. And at that time, a lot of the shares of publicly listed companies weren't doing as well. But over the next few years, we were one of the top stocks on the NASDAQ, and continues to be a stellar company. And then after that, my co-founders and I, from the sports site, we were like, you know what, we need to do another company. There was this guy called, you probably have interviewed him or know of him, Edward Tien, founded a number of interesting companies, including Asia Info and China Broadband Capital. And people used to refer to Edward Tien as a serial entrepreneur. And I remember the first time Christy Lou Stout from CNN was kind of describing him as a serial entrepreneur. I thought, you know what, I want to be a serial entrepreneur. So that kind of motivated me with my co-founders to set up Qunar, and that was in 2005.
So how did you come up with the idea for Qunar? I heard the idea came to you at a train station.
Yeah, that's right. It was me and the sports team were sitting at a Starbucks at the Hong Kong Airport Express train station, sitting, talking. You know what? We got to set up a business. And one of my co-founders said, well, you know what? We look at Google, they make a lot of money from a bunch of different verticals. We thought, could we create a better mousetrap for one of those verticals? So back in early 2005, late 2004, Google was one of the hottest internet companies, still is, obviously. And at that time, they were worth maybe $100 billion. And we just systematically looked at all their revenue streams. We realized very quickly that travel was a big vertical for them, as was automotive. Medical and healthcare was a nice vertical. Financial services was another one. And so those four we looked at very systematically and thought, okay, we're going to focus on one of these. And if we do well, we could also be worth $1 billion at least. And so that was our inspiration. And we ultimately picked travel because it didn't seem as regulated as financial services. It seemed very fragmented, unlike automotive. And the last thing we wanted to do was to, flog dodgy healthcare products, right? And so, which is why we decided to ignore the healthcare vertical. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of Chinese entrepreneurs that have focused on flogging dodgy healthcare products, unfortunately. But yeah, so we picked travel, and that was the initial impetus. I guess you could describe it as a very top-down approach. Where's the money being made? Can we carve out a piece for ourselves? Can we create a better mousetrap? And that's how it started. And then only later did we realize that a price comparison engine, a search engine, or a marketplace model, which is what Qunar ultimately evolved into, was the right business model versus some of the other travel models that we saw emerge.
And so when you were looking at Google and how they were approaching search and things like that, I mean, like you were thinking in terms of verticals, you're thinking about advertising revenue as the main business model, at least at first.
Yeah, that's right. So our thinking on revenue generation obviously evolved over time, but initially we thought this was going to be an advertising model. I had worked in the media business before. My co-founders had also, at least one of my co-founders had also worked in the media biz. So we thought this made a lot of sense. But what's interesting is over time, what we realized is, advertising and e-commerce models aren't that different, especially within the digital space. Like earning a commission versus selling a click or selling or some form of advert really was just a differentiation, a different pricing strategy. And so that kind of, really inspired us to kind of, grow the business, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. There's lots of different ways of starting a business. You guys chose to start with thinking about monetization early on.
Yeah, that's right. There's different ways to set up a business, or I guess find that spark of inspiration. One is the top-down approach, which is what we took, which is more like follow the money, I guess. There's another approach, right, which is solving a very personal pain point. That's like the Airbnb guys did that, right? Brian Chesky and his co-founders, they kind of had this very unique problem in San Francisco, and voila, they set up Airbnb. And then there's a third way, I guess, which is maybe you work very closely with your partners and you spend a lot of time, and then somehow there's some inspiration that comes out of that. So there's different ways of doing it. And maybe a final way is like some people say, I want to change the world. So, okay, good for you, change the world. I just want to make some money, right? And so there's different ways of thinking about it. I thought it was interesting, Matt, that you mentioned, having like domain knowledge, and we didn't. It is interesting. So me and my co-founders, we at that time, we had set up other businesses in China. So we were experienced entrepreneurs. We understood the technology landscape. So we had a lot of domain knowledge, not specific to an industry, but specific to, you could say, building technology companies within China. So we had some domain knowledge there, but not necessarily kind of within the travel industry. And what we've seen is most innovations in verticals usually come from outsiders. Sometimes it comes from an insider, but in many cases, it really comes from outsiders. Within travel, I could highlight a number of examples of outsiders that have come in who didn't have any experience and just create $1 billion business. Brian Chesky did it with Airbnb. Johannes Reck and Tao Tao did it with Get Your Guide. You see it with the Trivago guys in Germany. So we tend to see that a lot. So we didn't have any really direct competitors because back when we started, we didn't think Ctrip was a competitor because they had a different pricing model. Today, we have to ignore pricing models when we think about who our real competitors are or not. But back then, we thought, Ctrip's not a competitor because we're an aggregator of information. We're not processing transactions like Ctrip was doing. But obviously, having the benefit of hindsight, they were a competitor. But specifically, companies that were following our very, very, very specific model, there were only not many. There was a hobbyist he had a site that was somewhat similar to us, but he wasn't full time, and it was pretty much a tabula rasa for us.
So looking, still kind of sticking with like the conception of Qunar. I mean, so looking at you described some of your co-founders, and can you talk a little bit more about the founding team? Where and how you were able to raise capital, and how you guys looked at structuring the business itself.
Right. In terms of my co-founders, CC Zhuang, he's a brilliant technologist and frankly like a very good businessman also. And Douglas Koo, he's Malaysian Chinese, and then myself, and I kind of had a more business development, media industry background. And so the three of us had set up Qunar, and we had also set up Xiaowei, the sports site. And frankly, there was a third company we had set up. It didn't go anywhere. But like we don't like to talk about our failures, right? And then we also had a core founding team of 3 or 4 people who were extremely exceptional leaders and managers, technologists, and they were with us for many, many years as well. And so what we did was we always knew we needed 3 or 4 really, really good people who were super loyal, and we paid them extremely well, or I should say we compensated them with options extremely well, and were super loyal to them for many, many years. And then like they grew with us, like we all evolved and became better. And it was kind of a unique story where all of us had great strengths, and those became much more accentuated, and some of our weaknesses we were able to mitigate. But what we did was me and my 2 co-founders, we put up the initial capital, and then we were very optimistic because we had a success before. But what was funny was people ignored us. Then we had to talk to 30 venture capitalists over an 18-month period before a firm finally decided to give us some money. And so that whole time we're just paying out of our own pockets, and it was just getting very, very expensive. And so we were able to raise our first round of capital. I mean, we had some friends who put in a little bit of money, but it was a difficult period because so what's interesting, they say in Hollywood you're only as good as your last movie, and we're only good as our last startup, right? In kind of the tech space. And people who I thought would no brainer give us money were like, well, are you sure you want to do this travel thing? Travel's done already, right? Travel's done. It's going to be a little niche vertical dominated by a company called Ctrip, right? Nobody thought that travel could be so big, right, and so massive, and everything could be online and stuff like that, right? And so in spite of having a track record and some experience, it really takes a long time to get, to convince institutional investors to come in. So that was very tricky. But we were ultimately able to start raising capital, and we were able to prove to the markets that we were building a very viable business. But it was a very difficult period, that's for sure.
So what do you think did it? I mean, looking at those 18 months, how difficult it was. I mean, what do you think was able to get you that funding after all that time?
I think a couple of things. It's a funny story. So me and my co-founders put up our own money, right? First of all, right? So and we were pretty focused. And this one venture capitalist, it was kind of a compliment insult, I guess. And he said, Fritz, I really admire you and your co-founders because you're so dogged and you're so focused, although it's a bad idea. So obviously he missed out. But like another investor thought about it and said, well, these guys are really focused. And he even told us, he said that he loves the travel category. He wasn't sure what we were doing now was going to work, but he knew we could figure it out. And so that was why he made the bet on us. And so maybe we were able to show, because we were trying different things. And the investors that ultimately put in money had been monitoring our progress for a year. I mean, a whole year, you can imagine, right? Seeing some of the ups and downs and all that sort of stuff. But even then, the business wasn't really going that well. And then we didn't have much revenue. And then even after we raised, that capital, we still were struggling. Had a good thing is we had constant improvement. But the one thing is, my co-founders and I did not waver at all, which is interesting. There's this saying in Silicon Valley, or, some people use the word pivot. Oh yeah, we decided to pivot, right? Which basically means that you didn't have the wherewithal to stick to your vision, right? There's a technical word for pivot, which, like Eric Ries writes about, right? Which is really like optimizing and testing and stuff like that, right? But what we found is, a lot of people misinterpret that word for being, if things are difficult, just change direction. For us, because we hadn't read the book, when things were difficult, we just kept focusing, and sure enough, it paid off.
But I mean, do you think that, that first investor that he expected you to pivot at some point? I mean, and he was betting on the team rather than the product itself?
Yeah, he was. But he probably maybe thought that maybe we would pivot. And, we were tempted to do it. But what was interesting was it made so much logical sense. Like our vision just made so much logical sense that there was really no reason to pivot. So like we weren't getting traction or we were getting some traction, right? But it just made so much sense what we were doing that it just, like Google was making so much money from travel, and we were essentially providing a similar service to travel advertisers or sellers of travel products, right? It just made so much logical sense, right? And so because of that, we didn't change direction.
How did you come up with the name? And what about the logo?
Well, Qunar obviously means where are you going, right? So like it was amazing that URL existed, right? If you think about it. But how we came up with the idea was there was a book that Bill Gates once wrote. I think it was called like "Where Are You Going Today?" Remember that book? I don't know if you guys read it. And it was kind of funny. And then so basically like I was in a cab and I thought, "Where are you going today?" And I thought, okay, what Qunar, right? So where am I going today? And then what was really interesting was that was available as well as Qunar, right? So like that was the inspiration, was a billboard advertising Bill Gates's book, right? And so I thought that was interesting. And the camel was a temporary logo because we didn't know what logo we would have, and somehow it stuck, right? So it was like that. I mean, it was just, and the reason why you pick an animal is, I don't know, like you want something that looks good on a t-shirt, right? And, there's a Qunar province, right, in Afghanistan, right? So maybe, I don't know. And the Afghanis have camels, right? But yeah, it is a little bit funny, I guess.
I don't know. It still feels a little bit unpolished.
Yeah, that's right. We probably, certain businesses are very functional, provide a very specific service, and maybe branding and logo and design aren't as important. And that's what we did, a price comparison engine. Like we help you find great deals, right? Very functional. Other brands and businesses, a little bit more experiential. Maybe that's where logo becomes a little bit more important. I mean, not to discount jobs, and maybe we should have, and, looking back, maybe that's one thing that we could have done a little bit better on is think about the logo a little bit better, maybe, some of the polish and stuff like that. But we were so scrappy in some ways. When you're so scrappy for so long, you kind of forget how to be polished.
What were the key aha moments?
Yeah, maybe in like the early days, like one of the key aha moments was, I mentioned earlier about business model, like someone said, so, hey, Ctrip's different than us. Google's different than us. We're a price comparison company and Ctrip's a transaction company. But then what we realized is consumers don't care about business models. Consumer wants to buy a ticket, book a hotel room, right? That's the only thing they want to do. And so we realized we have to ignore business model and think very, very carefully, what does a consumer really want, and take responsibility for that. It's so easy. And in fact, it's one of the Google problems today, right? They list a bunch of stuff and you link out to it and they're not responsible to the kind of where that link goes, right? And then we're like, well, maybe we should be responsible for that, right? Because the consumer trusts our brand to come up with a solution. And like, I can't tell the consumer, well, I'm just a price comparison engine. Like I'm not responsible if someone cheats you or not, right? It's like when you go to the Financial Times in the advertising section and they say, we're not responsible for these ads, right? That's what they say, right? And we realized, well, maybe there's a different way of thinking on this. Maybe we should be responsible for those ads. And which, by the way, is, the Jack Ma playbook. And then once we realized we had to do that, we started implementing all sorts of standards for everyone on the platform, having a certain level of customer service, a certain level of transparency in terms of how they present their travel products to our users, return policies, accuracy rates, like all that sort of stuff. And so we insisted that everyone follow certain standards, I guess. And that was really driven from that inspiration of we need to be responsible for everything. Although our company may not actually technically process the transaction or be responsible for the delivery of those products, we need to be responsible for it nonetheless.
And so, this was, I mean, I just realized that, that it's kind of funny that we actually have to call this out, but this was, before the mobile internet, really. I mean, so all of this was being done on a desktop browser, right?
Yeah, so that was our initial success was on the desktop browser. But then it was interesting. I mean, we weren't the fastest in the mobile space. Even Air China had a mobile app before we did, right? Which is kind of weird because they're a government entity, right? But once we recognized how important it would be, we became really aggressive, and that led to a massive surge in spending to frankly ensure that we were on everyone's mobile phone. But yeah, when there's a platform shift, not many companies are able to capitalize on to the new platform. But fortunately, we were able to do it.
I just recall, I mean, there was just a conference that I went to back in like 2009. So just like as the mobile internet was kind of just getting started, kind of. But I just remember that someone from Ctrip said that even though they had their website, even though they processed a fair number of bookings through the site, actually a lot of their revenue was coming through phone calls. So people would look up something on ctrip.com. They would find a hotel or a airline ticket, but then they would end up calling to actually finish the purchase process. I'm curious, was it similar with Qunar as well? Did you guys see a similar kind of process where people trusted phone transactions more than online transactions?
Yeah, they did initially. I mean, usually in the world of e-commerce, I mean, it's kind of hard today to remember what happened 10, 15 years ago. But like it used to be, you would call up and then you would do a booking, but you would call anyways to make sure that they got it right. And then you would just do the booking, right? It would be the third phase, right? And so kind of in some ways, in some ways it was similar. But you know what, maybe one way to think about it is, the genius behind, the Ctrip founders was their whole view was we got to solve customer problems. If the customers want to use a phone, we don't care. We're going to have a scalable call center operation, right? Customers want to book online, we'll do that. If they want to do mobile, we'll do that. And maybe in the future, if they want to do virtual reality, we'll do that too. Like one way to think about it might be when online travel started with Expedia in 1995, I guess it was. They were representing sellers. So basically, Expedia's whole goal was we're going to go to airlines and hotels and we're going to try to sell your product better to consumers, i.e. they were representing suppliers to consumers. Qunar turned around and did the opposite. We said, hey, we're going to help consumers figure this mess out. That was our thinking. And Matt, like the example you just brought up, hey, people want to have a nice, top of the atmosphere look at price and how it changes. So we're going to provide that to consumers. So our whole thinking wasn't how do we help suppliers? It was like, how do we help consumers? And so that was kind of like our totally different approach to this. And luckily we were able to resonate with consumers.
How long did it take you to get traction? When did things really start to hockey stick in terms of user numbers?
It was just a gradual slog, which is really funny. It was just a gradual slog over the years, basically. Yeah. So unlike other companies that have this massive boom in traffic, we were like methodical, slow. But what happened was our consumers were extremely loyal. And, it was like one day we woke up and we found out, to be honest, this is a funny story. Like we didn't know how big we were because we were just methodical, traffic didn't spike. I mean, like we were going 3 times every year for 7 years, right? So you can imagine, like the power of compounding, right? Eventually you're going to be massive, right? But we didn't know how big we were until we were talking to Air China one day and they said, oh yeah, you're the biggest channel for us. Well, what do you mean? Oh yeah, amongst everyone, offline, online, anything in China, you're our biggest supplier of tickets. I'm like, really? Our seller of tickets. And we're like 3 times bigger than Baidu, 10 times bigger than Google, twice as big as Alibaba. We're the biggest player in the market. And it was like, and that was another aha moment for us. Like, oh really? Wow, amazing. That was probably, around 2009, 2000, something like that. So 4 or 5 years into it.
In 2011, you negotiated a $306 million investment deal with Baidu. Tell us about how that went down and what were your experiences there?
Yeah, right. So Baidu came on as an investor and they wanted to take control of the business. And so we had to make a key decision whether we stay independent or do we partner up with one of the big players. And like my co-founder, CC, likes to describe, there's a cost to being number one. And that cost might mean significant dilution, but at the same time, a lot of other strategic resources and benefits. And so we, in 2011, brought in Baidu to take about 50 to 53% of the company in exchange for a massive investment, which allowed us to accelerate our growth, as well as the traffic resources from Baidu and engineering resources and some other strategic value add. But there's a cost, right? I mean, we could have been independent, but we would have probably grown slower. Yeah, I think it was a great deal. I mean, we did become number one or number two, right? or like we challenged Ctrip for sure, right? So it makes total sense to have done it. We were tempted to stay independent, but I think it was definitely the right decision. I mean, and fortunately for us, we had a deeper relationship with Baidu than we did with Ali and Tencent, although we talked to all of them. I mean, like we talked to all the players, including the big global players, and it just seemed to make a lot of sense with Baidu to work with them at the time. Yeah, I mean, all three were, I think at the same size. And obviously when the mobile revolution continued to move quickly and the e-commerce revolution continued to move, both Tencent and Ali did a little bit better, obviously. Then we have some new challengers. And then, of course, Baidu's core business is based with new challengers, including Toutiao, obviously, and Meituan is doing an exceptional job and affect a number of players. So we see, but back then, those three were, so every few years you have, there's the top three, and like every few years they kind of change, right? Like many years ago, I remember in the States, people used to consider Yahoo and Microsoft as key players in the market, right? And nowadays it's like, what? So what are you talking about, right? I mean, Microsoft has kind of resurged, obviously, but Yahoo is just a shell of its former self, right?
Yeah. It's funny because it all seems, at the time, it all seems very permanent. Whereas of course, so we're talking about, kind of what that cycle might be, now with Alibaba and Tencent ascendant, but it feels quite permanent because their market position it seems pretty solid, and so I guess that's really the key with disruption. You never quite see it coming.
Yeah, that's right. And, that's the great hope for entrepreneurs is we've seen so much change, and, the volatility of, or you could say the churn rate for the top players seems to be much faster, right? Like it took, GE to be thrown off the, Dow Jones 30, like it took them 100 years, right? But maybe these newer companies on the Dow Jones are going to be thrown off much faster, right? Who knows, right? So we're seeing a bit more, so change is happening faster, more volatility, stuff like that, right? But I think, and again, that's some great hope for us entrepreneurs. Some people say, well, the big guys today are trying to control the market too much and financing too much and stuff like that. But that's what, we thought years ago as well, right? But who knows? Maybe that volatility will slow down. And if it does, that may not be good for entrepreneurs.
Especially when you were getting started, there was a lot of, shall we say, bad behavior. How did you cope with that? Did you have to get into any of the sort of dirty tricks yourself?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously no surprise. There's a lot of bad behavior in the market, right? I guess I'll take a step back. There's a lot of brutal behavior and there's a lot of bad behavior, and those two are different, right? I mean, like you have brutal competitors that are just conniving and aggressive, and we were the same way. And then you have bad behavior, which kind of goes into a legal gray area, right? And, I think it's important to differentiate between the two. And I would never advise anyone to participate in bad behavior, and we never did. I think some ignorant pundits and outsiders like to say that you have to engage in bad behavior to win in China, which I personally do not believe. However, some brutal behavior, maybe you have to engage in that, right? Using PR to your advantage, biting it out, price wars, poaching employees, all sorts of, blocking and tackling in a very ferocious way. But, that's just part of the course. So we had to deal with, we had a lot of PR battles with our competitors, which actually were some of the most fun parts of, the experience with Qunar, to be honest. But yeah, it was difficult. That's for sure. But hey, to be successful in this world, we have to execute well, we build teams, all these things that, we read about in the management books. And we also have to be very strategic. And being strategic means, amongst other things, being able to predict what we think our competitors are going to do. And too many people can't predict what their competitors will do, or they can only think one move ahead. But to be a grandmaster in chess, you have to be able to think 5 or 6 moves ahead, right? And similarly, I think to be very successful in the rough and tumble world of Chinese tech space, you need to be able to think a few moves ahead as part of your strategic planning. And this isn't the only part of strategic planning. Obviously, there's other parts, but I think some of the failed players haven't really thought about that too much.
So I'm curious, and so you mentioned that that the PR battles were some of the most fun. Can you give us? Are there any examples specifically that kind of come to mind?
Yeah, probably the biggest one was called Slashgate, or Huaxianmen in Chinese. And so on our website, we had the prices of all the sellers in the market, including Ctrip and Elong and a range of other players. And then anytime their price was too high, we'd put a red line through it, right? So if, for example, like the lowest price was $50 and Ctrip was selling it for $70, we'd put a red line through Ctrip's price. And for some reason, they took offense to that and they thought it was damaging their brand by having like a line through it. And so they sued us for it. And for some reason, the court took the case. And courts take cases in China for many, many different reasons, obviously. And so, they took this case and it was a really fun PR battle because at that time, we were probably 1/20th the size of Ctrip when they sued us. So it was kind of funny. And of course, they sued us for anti-monopolistic or say pro-monopoly practices, right? Or so like basically we had broken the anti-monopoly law. And so it was kind of funny that the company 20 times our size was suing us for breaking an anti-monopoly law. And then we had a lot of, a typical David versus Goliath battle that had raged on for a number of weeks. And like my head of marketing, who was leading that effort, became a very famous person in his own right. And people were talking about it. And obviously, like the greatest compliment was when James Long, the chairman of Ctrip, told me, Fritz, your PR is just brilliant. Hats off to you.
How's your Chinese? What was it like founding and running a Chinese company with limited language?
I mean, I speak broken Mandarin, right? So whatever that means, right? I mean, but, could I negotiate a deal in Chinese? It would be hard. But, I guess you could say like my Mandarin is like bar Mandarin, right? Let's have a chat, let's talk, stuff like that. But in order to be eloquent at a press conference or on a podcast, for example, I wasn't very good.
What about dealing with Chinese clients and partners? Did you have to adopt local customs, like drinking Baidu dinners?
I guess you have to, like Wayne Gretzky said, you have to go where you have to skate to where the hockey puck is going, right? Not where it is today. And what we find is most people in China don't want to drink Baijiu, to be honest. They'd rather spend time with their families or have a nice meal, right? And listen to some nice music. Like they don't want to have this horrible banquet, alcohol-infested experience, right? And it was something that I hated anyways, but I realized more and more Chinese didn't want to do that. They wanted a healthy lifestyle, right? So we just followed what we thought was right. And it was just like we were lucky because like we were able to pick up the cues, right? And realize that there's a lot of people who, don't want to do that. And sure, there were some who did, and I just had my head of sales deal with that silly stuff, right? But you're right. You don't need to, a localization is important, but we need to understand why it's important. And then you have to make a decision. So I'm not saying we were completely foreign. There's a lot of things we did that were local, and there were some things that we didn't have to do, right? Because we realized that even our local friends didn't want to do it. Yeah, so in the early days, right, so in the early days, our core team all spoke English well, but then what we realized was we were missing out on some amazing talent who actually didn't speak English. So me and my co-founder had to come to an agreement that we're going to hire some amazing people who don't speak English, and we just have to accept it. Because why should the company center around me? It should center around, the market, basically, because ultimately we're paid to build great products and exploit great markets and not cater to my limitations in Chinese, right? And so we changed. And we because initially we were hiring a lot of people who spoke English. It was like an important requirement, but then we realized that would be a waste of time and we would miss out on some unique opportunities. So we, and that's fine, like we were able to get around it through various tricks and strategies. For example, so we insisted all meetings be in Chinese, but we also insisted that there be a written agenda ahead of time, and we have a summary after the meeting written. So those could be translated for me. And so then and what happened was that process of having written agendas ahead of time and summaries after a meeting, all of a sudden we became more organized. That was the silver lining in this whole effort, which was great.
Was being a foreign-founded team ever really a roadblock?
No, we didn't really. I mean, it wasn't like to be honest, we didn't highlight it, and we also didn't shy away from it. It was like it is what it is, right? And like some people were like kind of surprised. They were saying it was like we were able to show, hey, there's foreigners in this company, but somehow it wasn't like stark, right? Because we were smart about it, and to me it was like, hey, like I only have a place in China if I contribute on a local level. So it's not like, okay, foreigners do foreign things and Chinese do Chinese things. It's no, we all do everything, and like anything in life, we have to add value, and if we don't add that value, we're out. right? Or we're not going to get compensated, right? And so I had to add value on a local level. I had to come up with ideas and perspectives about, local issues. It meant I had to learn a bit better. But then after many years in China, you pick up a few tricks along the way, right? And you have insights that could be valuable even to the locals. It isn't like a black box. Right. Surprisingly, Chinese people have breakfast in the morning, then they have lunch, and then they have dinner. They go to the office, they have kids, and frankly, they want their kids to do better than them. They think education's important and they like entertainment. It's like, well, that's exactly like anywhere in the world, right? People have kids, they have breakfast in the morning. They do all the same stuff we do, right? Maybe the breakfast is different, right? Maybe it's that hot bean soup versus eggs, I don't know, and bacon, right? But it's kind of the same. I mean, on one level, everyone's the same, and it's just these nuances, and you just have to be smart enough to recognize the differences.
But so kind of as a way to start wrapping it up, like kind of two questions with maybe a similar answer. So the first question is, if you could go back and do it again, is there anything that you would change? And what would be your best advice to entrepreneurs looking to crack the China market?
Okay, great. So probably the biggest mistake we made was we didn't value human resources, flat out. Our VP of HR initially worked for our CFO. Me and my co-founder felt HR was like an admin issue. We didn't understand the strategic implications of a really effective HR department in terms of motivation, compensation, all that sort of stuff. And I think looking back, we would first and foremost make sure that our head of HR was a very senior, experienced person who could spar with us on a strategic level and almost as an equal. And unfortunately, we didn't really focus on that too much. And I mean, I was just, in a very arrogant way, we thought this is admin, right? It's like accounting, right? HR and accounting, the same level, right? We didn't realize how important it was. I mean, obviously, Jack Ma has shown the way on how important this really is. So going back, I probably, in the early days, I'd have a strategic head of HR, and I would also myself educate myself and spend more time on that. My advice to entrepreneurs or foreign entrepreneurs, I guess, is simple: 3 and 10. Do 3 startups over 10 years in China, because you don't know which one's going to work. Maybe it's the first one, the second one, the third one, who knows, right? And you're going to have to commit 10 years of your life because it's going to take that long to figure things out. And if you're lucky, the first one works. But if not, it'll be the next one. And if not, it'll be the one after that. And if those 3 don't work and it's been 10 years, well, shake hands. You've had an amazing adventure. You've met a lot of great people. It's been some of the funnest, times of your life, and maybe go somewhere else. So that's how I think about it. Be super committed. You have to be committed to the market. That's the 10 years. And you have to be committed to doing more than one project because you don't know which one's going to work. And we have to accept the variability and the luck and the serendipity in success. Yes, we're capable and smart, but I know tons of smart and capable people, way more than me, that just didn't crack it. And I think some of that was a bit of luck and maybe being a bit more strategic and stuff like that, but it could have gone the other way too. So, I accept it, right? We have to accept that there's some variability and or serendipity in what we do, and it's no big deal. It's just, but if you focus on 3 projects, a serendipity kind of evens itself out a bit.
So, I mean, would you say that is it still possible for foreign entrepreneurs to, make an impact in China today? Or do you think there's opportunity for foreign entrepreneurs? I mean, it seems like these days there's not that many examples of, expats really kind of making a big impact in the China market.
It's true. Are there opportunities? There are massive opportunities, I think, for everybody. It's just, as a foreigner, you're going to have to compete with the locals and do it in the local way. And unfortunately for the foreigners, there's a asynchronous disadvantage when it comes to information, because most Chinese entrepreneurs, they know their market and they know the States too. They read English, they go to websites, they try to figure out what's hot in the States, right? And so your competitors, which are the locals, know both, right? But being a foreigner alone doesn't really amount to anything, to be honest. In China, it's just you're going to have to compete and fight it out like everyone else. Build good teams, and so it's not rocket science, right? You're gonna have to focus on it like everyone else. It used to be maybe 20 years ago. The notion of the foreign expert, quote unquote. I'm a foreigner, I must be an expert, right? That was about maybe 20, 25 years ago. And then a lot of Chinese would listen to you just because you're a foreigner, right? And then and over time, the Chinese realized, well, some foreigners are smart and some are useless. They started to differentiate, right? They realized that Goldman Sachs was like a different institution than the Riverside California Investment Bank or something like that, right? And then now maybe the pendulum may have swung a bit too much the other way, where all foreigners are useless. After the financial crisis in 2008, 10 years ago, they realized, well, maybe these guys aren't smart at all, to be honest. And so it really swung to one extreme. But now I think it's coming back a bit. Hey, you add value. It doesn't matter where you are or like. And also it's kind of hard to understand, what is a foreigner anyways, right? Like if you think about it, right? Because there could be a ethnically Chinese person who came back to China. Are they a foreigner? It could be someone who like grew up in China but went to college in the States. It could be someone who went to college in China and spent 5 years in the States. So we don't really know what that means anymore, right? But technically a foreigner without any references to Chinese culture whatsoever, without strong language skills, it's going to be tough. But I do think it's doable. It's being creative and smart and focusing on stuff, taking risk, and all the things that we read about in the management books.
The key in my experience is cross-cultural fluency, and that's where a lot of foreigners can find their value, and especially these days with so many companies going abroad, being able to consult in a sense or to bring an understanding of both cultures. And so in the sense of what's the value of this Chinese company, and how do I explain that to a Western audience, or how do I help this Chinese company to bridge that gap between the Chinese culture and the Western culture, because the gap is huge. It's amazing. I came across an infographic a couple weeks ago, and it organized the world's languages into different levels of difficulty for a native English speaker to learn. And as you might imagine, French, Spanish, all that stuff was a lot of the European languages. At least were in level 1. But then Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Arabic, these were all level 5. So the hardest languages to learn. And I think as any anthropologist or linguist will tell you, there's a very strong correlation between culture and language. And so to learn a language, you have to learn that culture. And so being able to learn the language, learn the culture, and bridge that gap is very, very valuable.
Yeah, so no doubt that's valuable. And so I'd agree. It's like it's certainly valuable. And so there's magnitude, and if something's valuable, right? And so I think if we look at the massive opportunities afforded to the world by the Chinese economy and society and people and all that sort of stuff, I think 80% of it is local stuff, right? And it doesn't mean that foreigners precluded from playing in that, but like 80% of the opportunity is like you get in there into the Chinese market, like you're playing the market game. This is the market economy. You're going to build great products and services to try to take advantage of this market, right? That's 80% of the opportunity. And then maybe there's 20% of the opportunity, which is for advisors, consultants, service providers, the financial guys, the lawyers, and maybe some of these cultural bridge makers that like you're referring to. And so, yes, it's valuable. And, that could be one strategy for somebody. And it's very useful, like no doubt about it. My only concern would be this is smaller than some of the other opportunities. And yes, the other opportunities are more difficult, but, sometimes we want to go for the big ones, like sometimes we want to climb Mount Everest because it's difficult, right? Because it's there, right? Sir Edmund Hillary said that, right? Because it's there. That's why I climbed the thing, right? It's difficult. It's big. 25% of the people who like attempt Mount Everest don't make it, right? And many die, perish, unfortunately. And so there's that approach. That's the 80%. And then there's the 20%, which is a little bit, the service providers and all that sort of stuff. And, again, it's valuable. So no one wants to take away from that. And that may be a relevant strategy. But, I'm kind of like, forget that. Go for the big thing. That's what.
Yeah. So, well, so just one last question though, because I'm super curious. So now you're an investor at Queen's Road Capital. Can you just tell us a little bit about that and what that transition was like? What do you think some of the biggest differences are between being an entrepreneur and being an investor?
Well, the good thing is that some of the similarities, first and foremost, is when you're running a company, we're always coaching and mentoring our staff, right? Getting them up to speed, motivating them, making them the best that they can be. And as an investor, we do the same thing. When we invest in companies, we try to mentor our CEOs and again, try to get them to be the best they be. And so that's similar. What's different, I think, is running a company, you have a mission. It's very mission driven. as an investor, we're managing portfolios, because that's the only way we make serious money, right? Is we got to invest in a few companies, right? And so that takes away from that unadulterated, single-minded mission that maybe like an entrepreneur has. And so that's kind of one of the big differences. And it was something that took me a while to get used to.
So do you think you would ever be an entrepreneur again? Kind of go back into that role?
Yeah, maybe. I'll think about it. Yeah, maybe.
Cool. Well, all right. So I guess that's about it. Real quick, as a way to wrap up, if anyone wants to find you online or get in touch through social media, where can they do that?
Well, they can go to our website. Just ping me. So queensroadcapital.com. Just ping me that way, or also on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn as well. So both ways.
Awesome.
Just go and ping me, and happy to have a chat.
Great. All right. Well, Fritz, thank you so much again.
All right, guys. Talk soon.
And that's about all the time we have for this edition of China Tech Talk. As always, if you enjoyed this episode, we'd really appreciate it if you left a review on iTunes, or if you're on Pocket Cast or Overcast, you can tap on that star button and it will recommend this episode to your network.